Hello, welcome to Biology 11. We continue with the study of plants. In our previous lesson, you were introduced to the various mechanisms of transport in the xylem and the phloem. In today's lesson, we're going to explore how plants reproduce with an emphasis on flowering plants or angiosperms. This is an idealized flower showing you here, and we're going to go on a review of what you learned in your grade 10 biology on plants and flowers and the structure of the male and female parts of the flower. So let's go over the goals of today's lesson. By the end of the lesson, you should be able to describe the life cycle of an angiosperm, specifically talk about the alternation of generations. You should be able to identify the various parts of the male, that's called the stamen, and the female, the pistil, structures of flowers. You should be able to explain the development on the angiosperms gametophytes, that is the pollen grains and the embryo sacs. And you should be able to list the various types of pollinators, as well as describe in detail the growth of the pollen tube and how double fertilization occurs using a diagram. And last but not least, draw a diagram for the development of the eudicot plant embryo. Eudicot is another name for a dicot. It's a true dicot plant. So the ones with two embryonic leaves in the embryo. So in the unit 1, when we talk about biodiversity, you were introduced to the alternation of generations when we studied lower plants as well as higher plants or vascular plants. And you may recall that plants reproduce both sexually and asexually. So sexually would be when there's a formation of gametes, and asexually would be by simple mitosis or propagation. It's called vegetative propagation. Plants reproduce sexually by sporic reproduction, also known as alternation of generations. So this is a simple diagram to remind you of this cycle in the life of a plant. So the plants can go from being diploid to being haploid, as shown over here. So if we start with the gametes being produced by the gametophyte undergoes cell divisions and produces the two gametes. The gametes are the male gamete, the sperm, the female gamete is the egg. Through the process of fertilization, when they're joined together, they're going to form the zygote, which is going to have the double number of chromosomes. It's a diploid. Then, as a consequence of this, this is going to be followed by several cell divisions to form the sporophyte. And the sporophyte eventually undertakes some divisions to produce reproductive structures. So reproductive cells are developed. And in these cells, or in these reproductive organs, meiosis is going to take place to form spores. And these spores are going to be haploid, or have the half number of chromosomes. And the cycle will continue. The cycle above varies among plant species due to the structure that releases the spores. So depending on the structure that releases the spore, the cycle may vary. But overall, in flowering plants, they're going to spend most of their life being diploid. This part might be shorter. It's very short. So that the dominant generation is the diploid generation, and the haploid generation is very in a small portion of time. Angiosperms, as you know, are also known as the flowering plants that protect their seed within the body of a fruit. And the angiosperms make up 3/4 of all plants on Earth. And this includes, for example, trees, shrubs, herbs, grasses, water plants, and so forth. And these are examples of a few with a very colorful flower. So every time you see flowers, you will be talking about the angiosperms or flowering plants. Now, in order to introduce reproduction to you, we need to look at overview of the angiosperm life cycle. And I have chosen this diagram because it shows the cycle in a very easy way and separate the phases in the cycle where a plant is in the haploid state or in the diploid state, the N or the 2N. So the haploid is shown in blue and the diploid in beige. So if we start here with a seed that contains an embryo, that seed is going to germinate. You plant the seeds in, let's say, in a laboratory experiment or at home in a garden. Those seeds are going to germinate, so they contain an embryo, and that germination is the further development of the embryo into a developed plant known as a sporophyte. This is a seedling, it's still young. A young plant is called a seedling, and the mature sporophyte plant with flowers. So this is going to produce different gametes. So if we look again, there's going to be in the flowers two major organs. The germinated pollen grain is produced by the male gametophyte on the stigma or carpel, and the embryo sac is the female gametophyte and is going to produce the egg, which is the female part. Here is showing you already the process of fertilization when grain pollens are deposited on this part of the female part of the flower, and then they germinate through those pollen grains to reach the egg and fertilize it. So fertilization takes place and there's the formation of a zygote. The zygote undergoes further development and becomes an embryo or a sporophyte. And this embryo is going to the walls of the ovary are going to develop into a fruit, which is going to guarantee that these seeds can be transported because they would be eaten by animals or humans, and the seeds can be dispersed. So it's a mechanism of dispersion of those seeds. So what we're going to learn in here is in a specific how all these gametes are produced and how fertilization takes place in flowering plants, and then later on how the seeds develop and from the zygote. So in order to do that, we must review the structure of the flower again one more time. So in your grade 10 biology, I've seen students using diagrams such as this one, where they're asked to label all the different parts that are shown. So starting on number 1, this number 1 comprises 2 and 4. So it comprises the whole structure, this tube centered with a bulb in the center. So that's known as the pistil. Now number 2 is the top of that, the pistil, is the sticky end of the pistil where the pollen lands. The narrow path or tube is called as the style, and the lower part, the bulb part, is the ovary where the eggs are going to be produced. Now for the male part of the flower, which is 5 here, the male part of the flower is known as the stamen. And the stamen consists of the filament that connects this one to the flower, is a supporting tissue, as well as an anther or anther sacs in here that are going to produce pollen. Then we have that the flower might be surrounded by petals, that the main role is to attract pollinators, as well as sepals that provide some protection to the flower, as sometimes the flowers open and close depending on the time of the day. And last but not least, the flower is connected to the rest of the plant through the receptacle. So it's like a support structure of tissue that connect the whole flower to the rest, and it will contain vascular bundles to bring nutrients to this plant, eventually to feed the developing embryos inside once fertilization takes place. And last but not least is the stamen. So 11 here is the stem. Now let's look at the male reproductive structure. So the male reproductive structure is known as the stamen, and it consists of 2 parts. The anthers on the top, which are, an anther contains 4 sacs, and those sacs contain pollen inside, as well as a filament, a support tissue. The anther is where meiosis occurs to produce haploid pollen. So in here, in this tissue, is where meiosis happens to produce the gametes, the pollen. The filament is a stalk that supports the anther. Now the female reproductive structure, if we look again here, we're going to see the pistil. So the pistil is comprising the whole structure here. The pistil comprises the stigma, the style, and the ovary. And inside the ovary, we're going to have some segments called carpels, where eggs are going to be developed from mother cells that are going to produce those eggs. And we're going to look at them in a moment. So the pistil consists of the stigma, the style, and the ovary. And the sticky stigma is where the pollen lands from the anther to fertilize those. The pollen grows a tube down through the style. So here is showing you, for example, that if the pollen landed, it's going to grow a tube. It's called the pollen tube, which is going to reach down to fertilize the egg. And meiosis occurs in the ovary to produce the haploid ovules or eggs. Now there are other reproductive structures that we must consider. They're also playing an important role, and these are the petals, which are colorful, and these are the structures that attract pollinators. So here we have, for example, roses, rose petals. The sepals surround and protect the flower bud, and they tend to be green. In some species they might be colorful, but in most cases they're green. So they're showing right here. These are the petals, these are the sepals. Now it's important now that we looked at the development of the angiosperm gametophyte, that is the pollen grain, as well as the embryo sacs. And we're going to use a diagram. And this is the diagram that we're going to use. So we're going to look first at the left side of this diagram, that is going to show you the development of the male gametophyte, that is the pollen within the pollen grain. So the pollen grains develop within the microsporangia. Microsporangia is another name in botany for the pollen sacs of anthers at the tips of the stamens. And they're showing here the pollen sac, also known as sporangium. Each of the microsporangia contains diploid microsporocytes, known as microspore mother cells. So this is starting here, microsporocyte that contain the microsporocytes known as microspore mother cells. Each microsporocyte divides by meiosis. So we have here divide by meiosis, producing 4 haploid microspores, each of which develops into a pollen grain. And then in here, a pollen grain becomes a mature male gametophyte when its generative nucleus divides and forms 2 sperm. This usually occurs after a pollen grain lands on the stigma of a carpel and the pollen tube begins to grow. So that only happens there. Now, if we look on the left side, we're going to see the development of the female gametophyte or the embryonic sac. The embryo sac develops within an ovule, itself enclosed by the ovary at the base of a carpel. So I repeat again, the embryo sac develops within an ovule, itself enclosed by the ovary at the base of a carpel. And carpels are the divisions in the ovary that we have where all these ovules are going to be contained. So starting on the cycle here, what happened here first is that within the ovules, megasporangium is a large diploid cell called the megasporocyte or megaspore mother cell. So we have the megasporocyte or megaspore mother cell. This megasporocyte divides by meiosis and gives rise to 4 haploid cells. They're showing you here. And give rise to these 4 haploid cells, but in most species, only one of these survives as the megaspore. So only one survives, the other ones die. Then this is followed by 3 mitotic divisions of the megaspore for the embryo sac, a multicellular female gametophyte. The ovule now consists of the embryo sac along with the surrounding integuments or protective tissues. So we're going to see this word here, integuments are protecting tissues. So the female gametophyte is here known as the embryo sac, is going to be made of these cells called the antipodal cells. There's 3 of them. Then we have 2 polar nuclei in the center. We have 1 egg cell, and we have 2 cells that surround the egg cell, known as the synergids cells. And this whole structure is known as the embryo sac. Now that we have seen the development of the gametophytes, and that is the pollen grain and the embryo sacs, we can look at pollination. So pollination occurs when wind or insects or other animals transfer pollen from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another, right? And the flowers vary depending on pollination mechanisms. So they're going to have different mechanisms to attract a specific type of insects that are going to pick up the pollen in their bodies and transfer that pollen. For example, this is a bee looking for the nectar in the flower. So this is a mechanism that is based on evolution. The plants evolve specific structures and colorful petals to attract specific pollinators that will be able to reach and get the nectar of the flower. In exchange, they will pick up the pollen in their bodies and transfer into other flowers. There are pollination vectors. Pollination vectors include the wind pollination, dull, scentless flowers with reduced petals rely on wind as the pollination mechanism. So these flowers tend to be dull or scentless. They have no smells, and that's the way they disperse their pollen. Then we have bees, butterfly pollination. Bright color, nectaries, scent. So the flowers are going to be bright color. They're going to have nectaries, and they're going to produce a scent that attracts specific insects such as bees and butterflies. They sip nectar, get pollen on coats, and transfer pollen from flower to flower. We also have bird pollination. Bird pollination is occurring with flowers that have nectaries, bright colors, and tube-like flowers. This is ideal, for example, for hummingbirds. Hummingbirds are excellent bird pollinators. And we also have pollination carried out by moths. Moths are attracted to white petals that open at night. And also there's pollination by flies. Flies are one of the insects that I don't appreciate much because they tend to land on really rough stuff. So flies can be attracted to rank odor, flesh, colored petals. So these ones are attracted to specific flowers that produce these very strong smells, such as rank odors. Now let's look in detail to the structures of the pollen grain, so we can actually see later on how is that fertilization occurs. So a pollen grain is shown here on the left. In the structure, they tend to have a very rigid wall, and they can survive very harsh conditions. So pollen grains contain 2 haploid cells produced through meiosis. They're going to contain the tube cell and the generative cell. So the tube cell will grow the pollen tube. It will become and develop the pollen tube, whereas the generative cell will go through mitosis to create 2 sperm cells. And these pollen grains are going to produce in the anthers. The anthers contain these sacs that eventually, when these cells are going to be developed, they're going to be toward the center of the sac. So the megasporophyte mother cells are going to be here, and they develop to produce these pollen grains that contain the tube cell and the generative cell. And remember, the generative cell will go through mitosis to create two sperm cells. Now let's have a look at the ovary, or the characteristics of the ovary. In the ovary, we have that each ovule within an ovary has a micropyle. Micro means a small, and pyle is an opening. And this small opening is for the pollen tube to come in. The ovule's megasporangium undergoes meiosis to produce 4 haploid cells. Remember that 3 die, leaving 1 megaspore. And the megaspore undergoes mitosis 3 times to produce 8 haploid cells within the embryo sac. So this is a diagram of the ovary for both gymnosperms that produce naked seeds and angiosperms that produce protected seeds. We're going to focus on this one in here. So we see this is only a part. The style is up here, the ovary. Within the ovary, we have this opening here for the opening called the micropyle. So each ovule is in here, and the ovule is going to contain the megasporocyte. They got megasporocyte in here. This part of the reproductive structure is connected to the rest of the ovary through the funiculus. And remember, the integuments are tissues that are going to protect this embryo sac. The ovary wall is over here. So another closer look at the pollen grain, and as well as the ovule and the embryo sac. So the pollen grain, remember, consists of the tube cell as well as the generative cell. So the tube cell is shown on the left with the nucleus, nucleolus, and the cytoplasm. And there's not a clear division between them here in this diagram. And the nucleus and the nucleolus and cytoplasm, or the generative cell, is on the right. Now the ovule the ovule that will contain the embryo sac. And remember, the embryo sac is a multicellular structure that contains many cells. It's going to contain cells called the 3 antipodals. These antipodal cells are located opposite to the micropyle, the opening through which the pollen tube is going to come to fertilize the egg. And the egg cell is surrounded by 2 cells called the synergids. Now let's look at the process of fertilization. So after the pollen lands on the stigma, a pollen tube grows down through the style to the ovary. And generative cell creates the 2 sperm nuclei. Double fertilization here occurs. That means 1 sperm fertilizes the egg, and 1 sperm fertilizes the 2 polar nuclei together, forming a cell, or a cell with 3 nuclei, which develops into the endosperm. So the endosperm is the tissue the cells that provide food for the developing embryo during germination of the seed. So let's sum up this part, which is very important for you to understand how plants undergo double fertilization. So the double fertilization again results from the discharge of 2 sperms from the pollen tube into the embryo sac. And 1 sperm fertilizes the egg, and the other combines with the 2 polar nuclei, giving rise to the triploid food storing endosperm. That means it's a 3N. It's a 3 set of chromosomes. I will be adding a very cool video that shows the double fertilization after our lesson is finished, for you to get a much clearer view using an animation of this process. Now let's look again at closer look at to summarize the growth of the pollen tube, and as well as how the double fertilization occurs using a diagram. And I've chosen to divide this process of the growth of the pollen tube as well as the fertilization in stages. So in stage 1, imagine the pollen has landed on the stigma of the pistil, right? So there's a recognition factor here. Not all pollen is going to be able to germinate or grow. Only pollen that is recognized by the stigma. There's a compatibility reaction here, histocompatibility reactions. So if a pollen grain germinates, a pollen tube grows down the style towards the ovary. And then once that happens here in number 2, it says the pollen tube discharge. You can see the pollen tube has come here through the micropyle. The micropyle, it went through that opening, it goes around, and the pollen tube discharged 2 sperms into the female gametophyte, which is the embryo sac, within an ovule. The embryo sac is within the ovule, so the ovule is the whole structure. 1 sperm fertilizes the egg, forming the zygote. Right, so we have the zygote here, forming the egg, forming the zygote. The other sperm combines with the 2 polar nuclei of the embryo sacs, large central cell. So we have this large central cell with 2 polar nuclei, and this second sperm is going to combine with them to form the triploid tissue or cells known as the endosperm. That cell develops into the nutritive tissue called the endosperm. This is what is going to provide nutrition for the developing embryo, or even for the seedling. When the seed is formed, this tissue would be the nourishing tissue that provides food for the embryo to germinate, becomes a seedling. Now, once the seeds are formed in the plant, we need to look at the seed and fruit development. So after fertilization has taken place, the petals and the sepals fall off the flower, and ovary ripens into a fruit. Right? So the ovary, specifically the ovary walls, are going to become the fruit, and the ovule develops into a seed. So the ovule contains that embryo sac that we talked about before, and contains all this group of cells, including the zygote and the endosperm. So here are examples of some of the seeds after fertilization in the process of losing those petals and forming the fruit. So this is a sequence for the changes that take place during fruit development. Now let's look at this using a diagram, how actually a plant embryo develops. So if you recall here, we have that after fertilization, after the double fertilization, with the pollen grain reaches the ovule and fertilizes the egg as well as the 2 nuclei of the central cell. That's the double fertilization. A zygote is being formed. So that zygote undergoes cell divisions, and it's going to form a terminal cell and a basal cell. The terminal cell undergoes more divisions to form what is known as the proembryo and a suspensor, and the basal cell remains as such. Now this pathway here is going, these stages of development of the embryo are specific for each plant species. So we go through something called a torpedo or a heart shape. This is like a heart stage, and eventually forms a very early embryo here. The embryo is going to be inside, and it gets pushed by tissues here. This suspensor tissue is actually pushing the embryo toward the center of the endosperm, so that it gets located where the food is ready to be available for the embryo when it needs it. And the 2 top parts in here of this embryo, these cells that divide and form these two projections, are known as the cotyledons, or the early leaves that are going to come out. So we're talking about that dicotyledon, eudicot plant embryo. So it has two embryonic leaves, or dicot. Once the seed is ready, there are mechanisms on how plants disperse those seeds that allow plants to colonize new areas and avoid shade of parent plant, because they need to find a space to photosynthesize. So they might have, for example, these leaves are easy to be blown away by the wind. So wind dispersal, they tend to have kind of wings. This is common in some of the trees that we see around here in Canada. They fly mechanisms like parachutes, wings, etc. Some of that do amazing dispersal of that are the dandelions and maple trees, as well as birch. And some are going to depend on animal dispersal. So they're going to produce fleshy fruits, which animals eat. They drop undigested seeds in feces, or burrs, which stick to animals' coats. And that way they can get dispersed to other parts of the land. We also have dispersion by gravity. So gravity dispersal. Heavy nuts fall to ground and roll, acorns. This is a very funny expression that teachers use sometimes. The acorn doesn't fall far from the tree, right? When they refer, if there's a similarity between a child and a parent. So it's a very old English expression, but it's referring to the fact that these seeds are fairly heavy, so they're going to fall very close to the tree by gravity. And then we have plants that are able to produce seeds that have buoyancy. Plants that near the water create floating or buoyant fruits, and the examples are coconuts. So they tend to have air pockets inside, really air pockets that they can allow these plants to float and end up being dispersed by the waves in the ocean. This is the end of our lesson. I hope that you found this very informative, and then be my guest to listen. There were so many details on the different structures of the flowers and the development of the gametophytes, the male gametophyte and female gametophyte, as well as the mechanisms of the double fertilization. Thank you for listening.